Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Jean Latore. I'm Aetna's Chief Investment Officer, and I'm also the executive sponsor for Aetnabilities, which is Aetna's employee resource group, which works with employees living with and thriving with disabilities. I'm very happy today to introduce Louise Murphy. Louise is an esteemed colleague and friend. She joins us from Texas, where she is based and serves as Aetna's Vice President of Behavioral Health. Louise has had an extensive career with Aetna and was instrumental in launching the team that developed Aetna's EAP brand in 2004 and bringing us to where we are today. Louise and team are actively involved in the behavioral health care and EAP industry and are deeply immersed in program design, implementation, account management, and operations. Creating customized programs that address work-life, wellness, and traditional EAP. Louise represents Aetna's strategy at industry forums regionally and nationally. She is a consultant to corporations across the country on contemporary behavioral health and EAP issues. Louise is a graduate of the University of Houston. She earned a master's in clinical psychology and also an undergrad in industrial and organizational psychology. She is a licensed professional counselor and a certified employee assistance professional. She is actively involved on a volunteer basis with institutions that support the cause of the mentally disabled as well as those affected by Down syndrome. She is a member of the Board of Advisors at George Washington University's Center for Integrated Behavioral Health Policy. They say things are bigger in Texas. Louise is petite, but her heart fits that bill. Please welcome our moderator, Louise Murphy.
Well, I'm glad you got to that part, Jean. We do have a lot that's bigger in Texas. So what a pleasure to be here today. And as Jean mentioned, I represent the behavioral health business here at Aetna. And I'm just really, really proud and grateful to be working with Grace Figueredo and our Office of Workplace Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion to sponsor this discussion today around a very important piece of work that's now here in Hartford, the play Next to Normal, which actually discusses and features a lot of very, very real and provocative and kind of thought-provoking discussion around the issue of mental illness, specifically in Next to Normal, the issue of bipolar disorder, and how it not only impacts the individual, but also impacts the circle around that individual. It's a unique piece because it's done as a musical, so you might not expect that there'd be a play about mental illness that is penned as a musical, but as J.D. Law, who joins us today as one of the principals in the play, as J.D. and I were just discussing, it's very, very brilliant the way this was structured and put together. And so we'll have an opportunity to showcase a little bit of that for you as we move forward today. We're here to have a panel discussion around mental illness, something that I have a particular passion around, this notion of having a discussion, of having open conversation around the fact that mental illness is an illness. It's a disease of the brain. It's not a moral failing. It's not a shortcoming. It's something that we should be talking about and need to be talking about more. And the individuals who I'm joined with today have devoted their lives and careers to that very issue and to that very activity. So I'll introduce J.D. Law, who plays Dr. Madden and Dr. Fine in the production Next to Normal. I should mention Next to Normal has won numerous Tony Awards as well as a Pulitzer Prize. So showing here at TheaterWorks in Hartford, downtown, will be continue to be showing for I think a few days longer. Is that correct, JD?
We're
through
running through May 7th now. We just got
well, that's a few days then. It'll be much longer. You've got time to get over there to see.
Tickets are selling fast, so get them.
Right. To JD's left is Dr. Barbara Van Dalen. Barbara and I have been colleagues and known each other for quite some time. She is the dynamic president and founder of two organizations, Give an Hour, which was founded to provide free mental health support to individuals in the armed services and their families. Give an Hour is expanding greatly, and she'll be talking a little bit about that shortly. Barbara is also the founder of the Campaign to Change Direction, addressing this very issue that we're here to talk a little bit about today, this notion of invisible disabilities and stigma in mental illness. To Barbara's left, Dr. Hyung An, the Chief Psychiatric Officer here at Aetna and also head of our Resources for Living Employee Assistance Program, another individual who I've had the pleasure to work with for many years now, and certainly a well-regarded expert in many of these issues. So Hyung, good to be with you today. To Hyung's left, Pamela Greenberg. Pamela is the president of the Association for Behavioral Health and Wellness. It's the trade organization in Washington, D.C. that oversees a lot of what happens in the behavioral health and substance abuse world. It's pretty boring for Pamela right now. So she had no trouble whatsoever in taking a few minutes of her time to come to Hartford and be with us today. So Pamela also is head of Stamp Out Stigma, and you have some of the material that is promotional material from Stamp Out Stigma that was on your chairs when you arrived. So we're delighted to have Pamela. Finally, Betsy Schwartz with the National Council on Behavioral Health, another individual whom we've had the privilege of working for a long time in partnership with many initiatives that Aetna has been involved in, that Betsy has worked with us on. Most notably and most recently, the programming around what we call mental health first aid. We collaborated with the National Council to develop a workplace module for mental health first aid. When I use the term mental health first aid, think of the concept of CPR, except for the mind. It's a fantastic program, and Betsy and her organization have done fantastic work in the creation and promotion and distribution of that program nationally. So it's a very distinguished group of folks that are here today to talk about Next to Normal and to talk a little bit about, again, some of the things that we think are important to converse about and to actually act on in this whole field. Mental health, okay, we could sit here and be here really till midnight, and we could talk about statistics, and we could talk about the way that mental illness impacts those of us in our lives. I was just sharing with Jean, not a surprise to her, and I'm sure not a surprise to you either, that there's not really a day or a week that goes by where you're in conversation with someone about what you do or what you're involved in your life's work, and it's inevitable that if you happen to mention, oh, I work in healthcare industry, or really what kind of healthcare? Well, mental health, oh my goodness, this is something else. Let me tell you, it's so interesting I met you today. My sister, or my mother, or my best friend's brother had an opioid addiction, and it was the saddest thing, and we watched this happen for 5 years, and it was awful. And, so it is a condition that affects and touches so many of us. It affects many of us directly. It affects more of us, in less than 6 degrees of separation, I can assure you. So the fact that 1 in 5 Americans suffer from mental illness, that it is one of the top 4 or 5 drivers of overall medical costs and health and well-being. It is an issue that is present in everyone's lives. There's not a day that you can pick up the paper now and not read about the opioid crisis and the ravages that it's exacting across the country. And it's always interesting to me when someone comments and says, well, and they were addicted to opioids, and it was a nice family, they were really from a nice family. And so again, this notion of what happens with these illnesses, it transcends all of the different categories that you can think of, and it's why it's important that we should be here and be talking about it. And JD, I'll toss to you a little bit, because I know we're going to show a clip from the play. So I was just curious about, walking into a show, you're an accomplished actor, you read a script, it says, okay, we're going to be doing a musical about bipolar disorder. This is an interesting, twist. So, and you're playing a psychiatrist in the production, also a psychopharmacologist. So just wonder what that experience has been like for you and being involved with this.
Well, being hired to act is always good, no matter the topic. Nice.
That's a given.
Yeah. To do this piece because, when you're doing any piece, it's about the story. And they nailed it. These writers that put this musical together just, they nailed it. I have, I don't mean to assume, but a lot of people, I've got family members that suffer from these same issues. Yep. So, coming in, and even we had 4, well, technically we're still in rehearsals, we're still in previews, so we're still going to have rehearsals this week just to fine tune and tweak things. But we, within the first 4 days, did an entire sing through, because it's all sung through. There's maybe a few scenes that are just spoken. I was sitting around with this cast, and we just sang through it because we learned all the music. And Rob, our director, was over in the corner with tears in his eyes, and we're all sitting around with tears in our eyes, and the actor playing Dan. And really, when a story is that, when it's that good and that powerful, all you have to do really is say the words and sing the words, and it's right there. But fortunately, we've delved a little deeper because we did have, we've had a lot of time to prepare this piece. But it's nice, and so far we've had a few nights of audiences, and it's so nice to be a part of something that's personal for people. And so we've had audiences jump to their feet, because it's not necessarily one of those shows where you're laughing throughout the whole thing. There's just not that much. So we'll be backstage going, "You think it's going okay? What's going on?" And then we've been very gratified when people kind of just jump up to their feet at the end. But it's more than that. We'll go out and people are stopping and just saying all of the emotions. I experienced all of the emotions this afternoon. So thank you, and to have that ability to share those things. And the show does end on a note of hope, but it's very honest. It's not all of everything's tied up in a nice neat bow. It's not that kind of thing, because that's not life, and that's, I think, why.
No, and that's not dealing and that's not dealing with these issues, right? They don't tie up in bows very easily, which is probably why we've struggled with how to talk about them for as long as we have. And again, it's wonderful to have Aetna involved with the communities at large, and certainly wonderful to be able to be attached to something like what you all are doing. Perhaps right now I think we could show just a little bit of the show, and so you guys can get a flavor. We'd want you, because tickets are still available, we do want you to go purchase a lot of tickets and go see Mr. Daw here and his colleagues. So can we show that, please?
Look, I can't do this. I'm like one screw up from disaster.
Your life is not a disaster.
Mom? What are you doing?
Mom in the play is Diane, and Diane suffers from bipolar disorder. In an early scene in the play, Mom is in kind of a manic state and is busy making sandwiches, and starts to make them, to where they're, kind of flowing all over the place. And it's just a kind of a brief example of a manifestation of this particular disorder, again, in its, kind of in its very, very frantic and manic phases. So let's talk, and Young and Betsy, I'll start with you, because, again, you've been in this for a long time. And when we think about mental illness and think about its prevalence in the community, bipolar disorder in particular, since we're addressing that. Just any comments about, kind of where mental illness manifests, what we see, what we don't see oftentimes, and, kind of some of the basics there.
Yes, so first of all, thank you, Louise. Thank you for sponsoring this and for Aetna's leadership. So especially related to bipolar disorder, we know that onset is around 25, and oftentimes people will self-medicate and further disguise and confuse the signs and symptoms. You know, the statistic of 1 in 5 Americans, which translates to about 43 million people, that's such a huge number. It's often hard to translate that into the individual story. In mental health first aid, we do a couple of exercises with participants where we try to help people understand what prevalence really means in a experiential way. And we do one experiment or group exercise where we ask people to line up with cards based on what they believe is most debilitating in someone's life. And what we find is that people often will think that non-invasive breast cancer is much more debilitating than major depression. And so we see, yet on the other hand, it's interesting because we see that people think that post-traumatic stress disorder is more debilitating than some other physical illnesses, when in fact they're underestimating the effectiveness of treatment. So there's a lot of statistics that we can talk about. I think the most important thing is that only 41% of people who have mental illnesses actually get help. And that's because either they can't access it or they're afraid to access it. And the other thing that's important to remember is that about 70% of people with depression will go to their primary care physician instead of seeking mental health help. So it's very important that all of healthcare is well-versed and knowledgeable around mental health issues.
So just kind of give you a sense of what it's like to live with bipolar disorders. Just think about the way you're feeling right now. And think about not being able to count on that feeling consistently. That your feelings and your mood will fluctuate from the highs. And people tend to focus on the highs with the bipolar disorder, but the most debilitating part is really the lows, the depression, and the fact that you can't count on it. And then with that feeling is the associated changes of your behavior, of your cognition. And so you can see it in that little vignette, okay, the episode of mania, followed by the severe depression that comes, and they swing between. And then when you kind of think about that and people trying to manage that, managing both their lives, as in the musical, or managing their feelings with what you talk about in terms of use of substance, use of alcohol, use of opiates, use of anti-anxiety agents. It's an extraordinarily, profoundly debilitating illness. One other thing I think that Barbara mentioned is really interesting is that 41% of the people get care. We haven't even started to talk about the quality of care that 41% gets, let alone the people who don't get care. So it's a profound issue in our society, mood disorders in general, but bipolar disorders, because it's also the disorder that puts you at a fairly high risk for suicide. Diane actually has a suicide attempt and gets hospitalized, and you can kind of see the array of treatment that she undergoes. And those treatments are also profoundly difficult. Medications are difficult to use. You sometimes miss the highs because the highs are really very energizing. And treatment, I mean, electroconvulsive therapy, I mean, it's still a treatment that's used, and still a useful treatment, but a very debilitating
That's
treatment
one of the
as well.
most powerful, I mean, there's a lot of powerful things about the play, but for any of us that have experienced individuals who have gone through ECT, it's a fairly scary thing to kind of be witness to and to be a part of. It has its place, and obviously it's much more targeted and controlled than it used to be, many, many years ago, but nevertheless, something that's kind of scary to contemplate. And I was interested, Hyung, around this issue of the disorder, and there was clearly there was a seminal event in this family's life that was the backstory to, not to give away the play because tickets are still available, but there's a seminal backstory that occurs in this family's life that that really exacerbates this woman's condition. And so obviously there's depression, there's mania. In bipolar disorder, they don't present equally, right? One can, it could be about small windows of manic behavior and then deep, deep depression and so forth.
Actually, mostly depression. In fact, many people who present to the primary office with depression gets treated as if it's depression, but it's actually bipolar disorder. And we know that sometimes treating people for depression can actually make the bipolar disorders worse. The other comment that you make, Louise, that's really interesting is that you're not born with the genes that give you bipolar disorder. You're given risk. The genes give you a risk related to bipolar disorder. And the life events, in this case, the loss of a child in the musical, has a cascading effect. So really kind of managing not only the medications or the other treatment, but the therapy that's involved is really also very critical, because you're not somebody who is bipolar, but you're a person with bipolar disorder. And that person has complexity and richness in their lives. And that needs support as well. So that's an important piece.
Pamela and Barbara, you, along with many people, were the very forward-thinking people around this issue of stigma. One of the things we haven't addressed yet is so much of what influences how people approach the issue of mental illness, their willingness to seek help, their willingness to even recognize the existence of mental illness or addiction, has to do with the stigma that surrounds it. And again, so many powerful stories exist around this notion of, I can't say this, I can't talk about it. What's XYZ going to think about me if I say this? I can tell you that I've got diabetes, I can tell you I've got a heart condition, but I'll be darned if I can tell you that I suffer from pervasive and persistent depression or I've got bipolar disorder. So as it relates to Stamp Out Stigma and the campaign to change direction, I'd love to hear from you guys on kind of what drove you to begin this work, and then how you see change happening. Barbara, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Louise, and I want to echo comments. This is a really important forum, and Aetna has been very forward-leaning to host these, to engage organizations like ours. So thank you for that. As I'm listening to the comments, one of the things that occurs to me, which I think is critical if we're going to change the culture around mental health, and that is the driving mission of the Campaign to Change Direction. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. But it really is to move from this notion that mental health issues, mental illness, belong to people over there. That I think JD said, I don't want to presume that everyone here has been touched, but I will, because I know it's true. Because I speak all over the country about these issues, about how we are all affected either personally or someone we love. And I always ask people in the audience like this, usually larger audiences, and say, if there's anyone here who has not been affected, raise your hand. No one ever does, ever, ever, ever. What's really cool though, when I do that, is people look around and you see this awareness that it's the first time maybe that they realize it's not just me, it's not just my family. That's where we have to get to. That it's all these issues that Diane struggles with in this musical, that is a brilliant musical. You really should see it if you haven't. I read it on the plane yesterday and I was like crying and laughing, and it was great. It's not just the bipolar extreme experience for this family. It's the adolescent and what she's going through that is within the normal range of adolescent who's under trauma and experiencing pain. It's the husband, it's the psychiatrist. Mental health challenges, emotional well-being, those are pieces of all of us, good, bad, extreme, but we don't act that way. We pretend for most of the day. We walk around, and if something comes up and there's an opportunity to share, then people will, oh yes, me too. But by and large, we continue to have this bifurcation. We can talk, as Louise said, about our physical challenges. I have a frozen shoulder that I have to deal with, and that's uncomfortable and painful, and I've had X, Y, and Z. But I won't talk about the fact that my mother is schizophrenic, because people might look at me like, oh my gosh, as if somehow they're going to catch it. So that's why we moved in this direction, to really take on the culture, to move away from focusing on diagnoses, more for this work to focus on raising this conversation because it's about all of us, then people who are suffering, are in pain, can get help.
Yeah, yeah. Pamela, in Washington, obviously, you're involved with, again, how this, how the field of mental health and behavioral health is considered, you know, in certainly legislation and how we're represented. And yet you also took on this Stamp Out Stigma effort as well, realizing that the two intersect very closely and clearly, right?
Sure. We actually, it's nice to be here and not talk about health reform for a change. So thanks for having me, Louise. But we do see it in our lobbying, actually. We supported the mental health parity legislation, and we're very, very strong advocates for mental health parity. And we could see in going to Capitol Hill and talking about it that behavioral health, and we're going back now, I'm dating myself, but going back 19 years when I started talking about mental health parity on Capitol Hill. And people, didn't really even know what you were talking about. The mental health benefit was different, and the attention just was not paid to the issue at all. It was surprising to somebody coming from the field that Capitol Hill didn't care about mental illness and addiction and didn't want to kind of set the record straight. And it took 12 years, I think it was, of advocating for one law. And we still talk about, implementing it and not losing it in health reform. And things have changed since then, mostly because of unfortunate incidents, right? I think behavioral health has gotten increased attention because people come back from war with post-traumatic stress disorder, because the movie stars are starting to talk about it. So, in some cases, not for the right reasons, but even bad things like wars have had good effects on bringing attention to our issues. But what we saw as our association represents health plans that provide coverage for mental health and addiction like Aetna. And I think we're looking at it saying, why aren't people seeking treatment? Why are the numbers what they are? And in looking at it, found stigma to be one of the primary reasons people weren't seeking coverage. Somebody who has that mental illness is dangerous, they're unpredictable, they're bad people. Well, why would you want to admit that you have a mental illness to your friend, or if you're a child, to your parents, and seek treatment? It doesn't seem like it's a promising road once you say that. And in doing my kind of homework for today and seeing the play, which was fantastic, and you're a much better looking doctor than the, I watched it on YouTube. I wish you were on my YouTube
let's stick
video.
with the topic.
Okay, so there was a great quote that I found that I just wanted to read to you because it really, to me, simplified the stigma and the impact that it has. And it's a psychological scientist who said, "The prejudice and discrimination of mental illness is as disabling as the illness itself. It undermines people attending their personal goals and dissuades them from pursuing effective treatments." And to me, that just
Captures
kind of summed it all up.
Yeah. I was wondering, JD, as an actor, I'm thinking of Diane specifically, the character Diane, who's the principal character around which all of this revolves in the piece. And I'm always interested in, what it's like as you're going about just being yourself, and then you have to come into that character. I was wondering what it's like to watch Diane, in particular, who's this person with bipolar disorder. Y'all are out having coffee, and all of a sudden she's, in the theater in this character. That's got to be an interesting experience to kind of witness.
It's the, first, Christiane is lovely and talented, and she's been around this business for a long time, and she could not be a more generous actress to work with. And and you're right, we will spend time outside and go and have a drink, and everything's what it is. I think and I always go back to the writing. When the writing is good, it's good. And she and I have talked about this, all of us, the whole cast. But when you walk into the room as an actor, we can only be who it is that we are. But then what we do is we change our circumstances. So the writing and the story gives us those other circumstances. So we bring who it is that we are, as if we were in, unfortunately, she's dealing with 16 years of bipolar, and probably she's more likely schizophrenic because she has delusional episodes. So once she just allows herself to respond to what's going on, all of a sudden you're
That's
going,
interesting.
oh wow, there's some things going on
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you know
Yeah.
she doesn't normally have going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I want to give each of you, starting with you, Betsy, an opportunity to talk about your specific organizations. This is a very distinguished group of folks that are here, and the work that they're doing is not only domestic in scope, but many of these people have been involved internationally in this conversation around mental health and mental illness. And so I want to just give you, we could again have long conversations, but just give you a brief flavor for their involvements. Betsy at the National Council, again, great work that you all are doing there.
Thank you. So we run a program called Mental Health First Aid, which is an international program. It was created in Australia in 2001, and the National Council brought it to the U.S. in 2008. And over the last 10 years, we've trained 1 million Americans with a goal now to train millions more. But I'd like to go back to the comment about stigma, because I think the word stigma in and of itself is often confusing. And you know, we don't really use that word in relation to any other illness very often. And I think really when we think about stigma, what is it? It's really fear, it's ignorance, it's misunderstanding. And so when you think about what's going to change that dynamic, that's where mental health first aid really comes into action, because it's an attempt to not only normalize the problem, but give people the concrete tools that they need to be comfortable having a conversation. So, you know, we all have the best of intentions. If we see a neighbor, a colleague, anyone in our community struggling, we want to be able to help. We want to do something, but do we really feel comfortable? Like, you know, even when you see a homeless person on the street, what's your own individual fear level? Or if your neighbor is showing signs that they really may be thinking of killing themselves, how comfortable would any of us be in saying, are you thinking of killing yourself? So mental health first aid has resonated and I think really struck a chord throughout the country because it's very concrete teaching and tools. So through what is an 8-hour class, people role play, they problem solve, they learn, they draw pictures, they do all kinds of things that by the end of that time together, the research shows that people have increased their knowledge base. They now recognize the signs and symptoms for bipolar, for addictions. They know what to look for. They know how to have a conversation. They know they've practiced in a safe environment. How do I talk to someone who I think may be using drugs or alcohol? And they know how to give local referrals and how to listen non-judgmentally. We have a 5-part action plan that's assess for risk of suicide, listen non-judgmentally, give reassurance and information, and encourage self-help and professional help. And through that 5-part, very simple action plan, people learn. And Aetna has been a special leader because I remember the day vividly right after Sandy Hook, the tragedy of the children in Sandy Hook, that I received a call from Dr. Un, who I knew from my previous Texas days. And Dr. Un said, Aetna wants to be a leader. We want to work with you in changing this reality. And from that, it was, as Louise mentioned, the beginning of our workplace mental health first aid initiative. We created what's now a 4- and an 8-hour curricula specifically designed for workplace. And Aetna was the first to train 30 of your own staff to be mental health first aid instructors. And those mental health first aid instructors, as Aetna employees, have trained thousands of your colleagues as well as members in the community. So we know that mental health first aid has really become a movement. It's a kind of train the trainer model. So we have over 12,000 certified instructors in every state in the country. So we know every single day over 1,000 people are being trained in mental health first aid. And as that number grows exponentially, we think that it will really change the conversation in every workplace, in every dining room table, and in every school.
Thank you, Betsy. Pamela?
Great. So with Stamp Out Stigma, it's a campaign that we got involved in 3 years ago, actually 3 years ago this weekend. And Aetna is also involved in it. And for us, it stems around what we call the 3 R's. So, and those are recognizing the symptoms, re-educating people about mental illness and addiction, and then hopefully reducing stigma. ABHW implements it mostly via social media. And you know, as somebody who didn't grow up with social media, at first I thought, well, how are we going to implement a campaign on social media? Well, I've learned a lot, and it's actually been fantastic. We have on a Twitter account, @StampStigma, over 19,000 followers. We host Twitter chats every month on different topics and have guests on the Twitter chats. And I think what struck me the most with those are I was watching the Twitter chat, and we had somebody who say, this is the first time I've told anybody that I have a mental illness. And so they came out, if you will, on a Twitter chat. But that's, you know, one, where our society is going, but the feeling that I had of that we were there for this person, and there was the support, you know, everybody kept tweeting in, you're not alone, all the things that we've said. So the support that was there, we're on Facebook with over 5,000 followers. And really what we're trying to do in the social media efforts are to let people know that they're not alone, that there is help, that they didn't do anything wrong because they have a mental illness. And as I talked about earlier with movie stars and things like that, it really does help to have those names. So a lot of times our tweets and our posts are about movie stars who are talking about their mental illness. That's just a big help. Blog posts. We encourage people to write about their mental illness and to tell others about it. And then our member companies are implementing it as well, both with their employees, and I have given you all bracelets today. You may already have been given one, and the pledge card is in there. We encourage people to take a pledge to talk about mental illness and addiction and to kind of bring it out of the shadows. The member companies hand out those cards. They host lunch and learns where they talk about mental illness. The one, Louise may not like that I say this, but some companies, if you wear the green wristband on Fridays, you can wear jeans. So if you're not already a casual environment, you may want to talk to your boss about being able to do that. We have big green stickers that say, I care about mental health and addiction because, and you write inside why you want to talk about mental health and addiction, and post those in break rooms. Our companies have brought this campaign to providers. They've brought it to the members, the consumers and patients that they serve, and also to their employer customers. So in fact, we got a call the other day that one of the large telephone companies wants to order 3,000 of these wristbands because they're doing something around mental health and addiction. So we've just really been able to spread the word through the campaign.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dr. Unn? It's a bit self-serving, but you head up the very, very successful Resources for Living program within Aetna Behavioral Health.
It's a wonderful opportunity because, you know, we tend not to think about our employee assistance program called Resources for Living, which all of you have. And in fact, if you look in the back of your ID card, the Resources for Living number will be there. So it's right there with Spock. So I feel like we made it. So the name is intentional. In Resources for Living, we don't talk really about behavioral health. You know, if someone said, go see a psychiatrist, that's kind of scary. But if you want just Resources for Living, it's wonderful because it's about living. And that's what having a behavioral health disorder, having issues in your life is about. It's really everyday stuff that Resources for Living can provide help with. And it provides access to counseling. It provides an array of service called work-life services where, you know, if there are legal issues, financial issues. Think about Diane and her household, right? It's a household benefit. So anyone who lives in that household has that benefit. That's great. And then, you know, Diane, manic episode have run up her credit card, so she may get financial services. or may have done something, during an intoxicated state and gotten a DUI. We provide legal services. Because, it's what I say, which is that it's the person with that illness, and that person has a very complicated life. And if we can support that person in their life, then I think that they can help themselves in terms of managing their disorder better. So that's what Resource for Living is about. Check it out. We have our website. We have all kinds of interesting tools. Aetna's really good at utilizing the services, but we could do even better.
Yep,
So.
absolutely. Barbara?
So I'm listening again to my colleagues and the conversation about the play and thinking about, that it really is the time that we take this on in our world. And I think that you'll hear, how there's these movements and these campaigns and these initiatives because it's critical that we address this. I talk about often that this is the last frontier. I grew up and we whispered about cancer because people were afraid to say it out loud. I grew up when there were no designated drivers, and my high school friends, many of them died in car accidents. Those were cultural changes. And so, as Louise said, I first founded Give an Hour, which provides free mental health care to those who serve their families, their communities. That's where we first met, Louise and I, around harnessing civilian mental health professionals to give their time. We've given 220,000 hours, about $22 million. Aetna's been a huge partner in that. But it was clear that we were seeing what is a microcosm of the greater culture, which is we expected our service members to come home and say, excuse me, I have post-traumatic stress. I've been drinking too much. I lost a good buddy, and I'm angry and I'm smashing things. We don't do that in our culture. And so it was actually also Sandy Hook that triggered Vice President Biden's office reaching out to me and asking us to take a look at what is missing? Why are these horrific things happening? And so it was very clear that there are a lot of great programs, but if people don't access them, if people don't say, I want these programs, if they don't say, I want mental health first aid in my school, it's not going to happen. So we come in at the very cultural level, very top, if you will, 30,000-foot view. We all know the signs of a heart attack. If JD, he's young, so I'll pick on him, started to complain of chest pain, or he started sweating profusely, my arm hurts, we would all think, could be a heart attack, and we would take action. We reasoned that our culture as a whole does not recognize signs of emotional suffering. We know the signs of a heart attack. Enough of us know enough of them to save lives. We're starting to learn the signs of stroke. Enough of us know enough of those to recognize what to do if Dr. Un started to exhibit some of those signs. We do not, as a culture, recognize the signs of emotional suffering. That's what the Campaign to Change Direction is all about. And we also reasoned that if we're going to change culture, we have to go after iconic figures. So the first person who spoke for the Campaign to Change Direction, our first champion, was First Lady Michelle Obama. Dr. Biden quickly followed. We also work with Prince Harry, pretty good champion, if you want to change culture. And he's been amazing because he talks not only about the importance of this, he talks about himself. He talks about the loss he experienced when his mother died, the trauma. He talked about what happened to him when he was a Black Hawk helicopter in Afghanistan. He talks about his own post-traumatic stress. Prince is out there talking. It's amazing. His brother and sister-in-law are also working with the whole focus on Heads Together is the UK version of what we're doing. We've partnered. We're also working with Canada. Let's Talk, Bell Let's Talk is wonderful Canadian endeavor that's focused on this. So for us, if we can help lift up the culture, so we have Richard Gere now talking about it with us, and Brian Wilson and Chris Stapleton, it pulls these conversations up so that we can all talk comfortably, and then behind it, rush in great programs that can then provide curriculum training. But until we change the culture, till we get people to go, yes, anxiety is in my family, so I run a little anxious. Or yes, I've dealt with depression, or I had postpartum depression, or schizophrenia, or bipolar. We can't make these changes so that people actually get help when they're suffering.
You know, it's been mentioned here already this morning, but not only does an individual with mental illness or addiction struggle, but as we alluded to at the outset, the individuals in their circle, as their family, their friends, colleagues, coworkers, also inevitably become impacted by this as well. It's very powerfully demonstrated, right, in the play with Dan the husband, with Natalie the daughter, with Henry the boyfriend, with even the Dr. Madden and Dr. Feiner, they're clinical people, right? So their head goes to, okay, what do we do next? Don't worry, we'll fix this. We can try this. We can try that. We can, But so there's a lot of people organized around this in a variety of different ways. And, any of you who wants to comment briefly on this notion of the family, and it's not just the individual, but in a unique way, the family is drawn into this as well. And by themselves, you're dealing in a dysfunctional circumstance, so your reactions oftentimes, don't feel functional. You kind of address this a little bit, Betsy, in your remarks.
Sure. So and I think if we take the concept of family and broaden it, because it could be the family of your coworkers, it could be your family at your church or synagogue, it could be your neighborhood, it could be the local policeman who goes to your school. We know through Mental Health First Aid every day we receive stories of people that are in schools. It's really interesting. Last week we had a congressional briefing. Unfortunately, it was the same day that the health care bill was happening, and so it was kind of a challenge to get a lot of attention. But we had this lovely woman from Hartford who is a state trooper, and she talked about an experience that really stood out in my mind. She was 7 years old on a family vacation in California, and her family was driving on the mountain, if any of you've done this on Highway 1, right on the edge of the cliff. And a man ran out in the street in front of the car that her father was driving, and her father had to make a split decision of whether he was going to drive off the road, off the cliff, or hit this man. And he hit the man, who had later shown had written a note about his suicide. And the trauma that stayed with her led her to become a state trooper. And now she's working to every day provide help within a law enforcement context. So we know the impact on the family, and I think what we hear from Mental Health First Aid is that any of us can be the one to make a difference. It really doesn't take a professional help. It takes knowing how to listen, how to react appropriately and supportively, and any of us can be the one that really makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think to piggyback on that, I think that's a great example of, that we all carry around with us predispositions, tendencies, knowledge, expertise, language. So, we think about any of our children, any of our loved ones. Things happen in life. Losses happen, trauma happens, illness happens. And what we often see is it's the lack of attention to the emotional components of all of that lead to then further emotional components. So prevention, early intervention is really about often language, identifying, naming it. I mean, we see this in the play, this whole, name his name to sort of get the trauma out front. But our tendencies, and people often ask me, why don't we talk about these things? We'll be out at an event similar to this, and people say, why don't we talk about this? And I think about this a lot, and I think, humans, for good reason, don't like to be vulnerable. Way back when we were in caves, if you were vulnerable, the lion ate you. And so you don't want to seem like you're different. You want to stay with the pack. You want to look like everybody else, because being vulnerable leads to a fear, the fear of rejection, hurt. But what we are seeing in all of our efforts, I think over and over and over again, which is so hopeful, when people share, people wrap around them. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm so impressed that you shared that. Thank you for sharing that. I feel closer to you. So our fear is actually not founded. but we still function as if we're in the cave and that we're afraid to let it out. But if we do that, we can often prevent things from becoming worse for ourselves and people we love.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a slightly different perspective. So caretaking for family members who are ill is a stressful process, right?
Any illness, right?
Any illness. But caretaking for someone who has a psychiatric issue, say bipolar disorder, is extraordinarily stressful. And so having the opportunity to connect with each other, to be able to talk about that is critical. I mean, because the caretakers are susceptible to developing their own set of illnesses. Your ability to caretake the person who is ill also gets impacted. So it's a very important aspect that I think the musical brings out in terms of what happens at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it was interesting in the musical too, because for so much of it I found myself feeling most empathetic towards the husband who I don't think you really knew he suffered from a mental illness as well towards the end. And I thought, well, this isn't the person that I should be feeling sorry for, right? I should feel sorry for the person with bipolar disorder. But they did such a good job of showing how it impacts the whole family and loved ones. And I think
exhausting it is.
Yeah, and the important message I think for all of us is to be supportive, and that you don't just have to be, you need to be supportive of the person that has the illness, but like, let's say if a friend says, oh, I'm dealing with my sister who has bipolar disorder, you can be supportive of your friend, and you think, well, what can I do? I don't know the sister. But that friend needs so much support too, and they need a community that they can talk to about what they're going through without judgment, because obviously they can't complain to their sister, right? The sister has a lot going on, but to be there for that whole group of people is really helpful.
Absolutely. We could be here again for a long time having this discussion, and it's been a great hour of time and opportunity to again listen to these distinguished folks talk about the things that they're thinking about and doing out in the community. I'll invite anyone who might have a closing thought, and we may have an opportunity to take a question or two, but certainly, JD, I'll start with you. Any closing thoughts on participating in the panel and in the work today? So,
well, I'm just going to say thank you. It was lovely to meet you. You kept saying all these distinguished people, and JD. So thank you.
All right.
But you didn't do that. I was doing that. That's
well played, JD.
But with all seriousness, thank you all so much for just having me. And I think that this is a huge thing. And I'm just talking personally now, and I have a very dear family member that it goes through what Dan does ultimately in the show, and to know that this has been very educational. So.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. Any other closing thoughts by any of the panel?
Well, I'll just say, first of all, your work in the play, helping people understand, putting it out there is incredibly important. So keep doing that. Look for projects that are honest. That's one of the things we're doing in our work, is engaging the entertainment community to tell these stories honestly. And I guess that theme for me is something that we all need to take to heart, which is look for opportunities to be honest, to share. When that person tells you, oh my gosh, my husband is now going through a major depression and I've never dealt like this before. If you yourself know about that and you've gone through that, or somebody in your family, share that. When we can get to the point where I can say, gosh, my anxiety is really flaring up, just the way I would say my frozen shoulder is really killing me today, we'll have changed the culture.
So I would say two things. One, the motto for Stamp Out Stigma is talk about it, your story can change a life. And so I encourage all of you to talk about your experiences with mental health and addiction. And then also to use the right language. Using the right language really does help reduce stigma. And by that I mean, you don't say someone's bipolar. You say they have bipolar disease. You wouldn't say someone's cancer, right? And you don't say somebody committed suicide. You say they died by suicide. So just looking into the right language really does make a difference and helps us in our journey.
I think we're all saying the same thing, which is that we need to normalize mental health and addiction challenges in the same way as any other health condition. And that change starts with each of us. And if we have the skills and the comfort level to be able to really act every single day, no matter what setting we're in, we know there will be an opportunity every day to really be the one to make a difference. And just, there's no point in struggling or living in silence. And I think if we all really believe that in our core, we will in fact change the world.
I'm really grateful to have been a part of this program today, and grateful to all of you for sharing your time with us this afternoon. Takes a lot of work to pull this kind of event together, so I want to make sure to thank Flora Vivaldo, Mary Von Vidal on my team, Chris Montrose, Brenda Pabin, certainly Grace, and the Office of Workplace Culture and Inclusion. Jean, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you're doing with the Aetna Abilities ERG. I think it's an important message that we're giving to our employees in this organization. And certainly to all of our esteemed panelists, the Honorable J.D. Dahl.
Thank you, Sheila.
Dr. Barbara Van Dalen with Give an Hour and the Campaign to Change Direction. Dr. Hyung Un with Aetna Resources for Living program. Pamela Greenberg with the Association for Behavioral Health and Wellness. And finally, Betsy Schwartz with the National Council on Mental Health. Thank you so much for being here today, and hopefully this was a great learning experience for you. Have a great day.